It's just a formality, Martin. Sign it, and we can go back inside. Your mother needs you. Those were the words. That was the moment. I was standing in the hallway outside the ICU on the third floor of Hargrove Regional, still in the clothes I'd driven 4 hours in, and Diane was holding a single folded page and a pen she'd produced from somewhere in her coat pocket with a fluency that should have told me something. My mother was behind the glass. Tubes, monitors, the specific mechanical breathing of a woman who had built everything our family had with her own hands and was now reduced to a series of numbers on a screen. I hadn't slept in 30 hours. My brother Frank was somewhere downstairs in the cafeteria, probably on his third coffee, probably staring at a wall. I signed. I didn't read it. I remember the pen. It was heavy, a good pen, the kind that doesn't come out of a coat pocket by accident. And I remember Diane folding the page before the ink was fully dry, tucking it back into her coat with the specific efficiency of someone completing a task rather than offering comfort. I remember thinking, she's so capable. Even in a crisis, she knows what needs to be done. That thought, in retrospect, was the most expensive one I've ever had. My name is Martin. I'm 47. I design infrastructure, bridges, drainage systems, the underground bones of things that are supposed to hold without being seen. I've spent 20 years calculating load tolerances and stress points, and the precise conditions under which a structure that looks solid begins to fail from the inside. I should have been better at this. Diane and I had been married for 9 years when my mother had her stroke. We met through mutual friends at a fundraiser in Nashville. She was a paralegal at a civil litigation firm, sharp and composed and possessed of a laugh that arrived unexpectedly and transformed her face completely. I fell for the combination of those two things, the composure and the laugh. The sense that she was two different people in one, and that I had access to both. We moved to Hargrove because my family was there. My mother, Cecilia, my brother Frank and his wife. The house my parents had built on 12 acres outside town. A working property with a farmhouse, 2 outbuildings, and land that had been in the family since my grandfather's time. When my father died 8 years ago, the property passed to my mother outright. When my mother eventually passed, Frank and I were her heirs. Everyone understood this. It had been the working assumption of our family for 20 years. Diane understood it too. She had understood it from the beginning. My mother died on a Thursday in October, 6 days after the stroke. She didn't recover consciousness. There was a window, maybe 48 hours, when the doctors used words like possible and hopeful, and Frank and I took turns sitting with her and talking, just in case she could hear. Then the numbers on the screens began telling a different story, and by Thursday afternoon the window had closed. Diane was there for most of it. Attentive, present, handling logistics the way she always handled logistics, efficiently, without drama, with the quiet competence that I had spent 9 years interpreting as devotion. She made the calls. She coordinated with the funeral home. She dealt with paperwork at the hospital while Frank and I sat with each other in the family waiting room and tried to absorb the fact that we were now the generation at the front. I was grateful. That's the word I used to describe what I felt watching her work. Grateful. Even now, writing this, I have to sit with how completely that word obscured everything underneath it. After the funeral, I found the document in our home filing cabinet. Not deliberately. I was looking for the title to my truck, which needed to be renewed. The folder was labeled Estate, Cecilia and Diane's handwriting, which struck me as organized in a way I hadn't asked her to be. Inside were various documents I recognized: the hospital paperwork, the death certificate, the funeral home contract. And one document I didn't recognize. It was the page I had signed in the hallway. I finally read it. I'm a civil engineer, not a lawyer. I read documents in the specific way of someone who is technically literate but not legally trained. I understood approximately 70% of what was written. What I understood was enough. The document was structured as a spousal acknowledgement of property interest. In plain language, and I am deliberately using plain language, it appeared to establish that Diane held a recognized marital interest in any property I inherited from my mother's estate. It referenced Tennessee's elective share statutes. It had my signature at the bottom. It had a notarization stamp. A notarization stamp. I stood in the hallway outside my home office with that page in my hand and thought about the pen. The heavy pen. The pen that came out of a coat pocket in a hospital hallway at 11 o'clock at night while my mother was dying. A notary had to be present for that stamp, or the stamp was fraudulent. Either way, Neither option was the one she had implied when she said it's just a formality. I put the document back exactly where I found it. I went downstairs. Diane was in the kitchen with Sophie, helping her with a drawing, and I stood in the doorway and watched them for a moment. My wife and my 7-year-old daughter at the kitchen table in the warm light, and I understood something with absolute clarity. I could not confront her yet, not without understanding the full scope of what she had built. The weeks after my mother's funeral had their own particular weight, the specific gravity of grief that doesn't resolve, that settles into the rhythm of your days and becomes part of the texture of ordinary life rather than a separate event. I went back to work. I managed projects. I drove Sophie to school in the mornings and listened to her talk about her teacher and her friends and a hamster named Gerald who lived in the classroom and apparently had strong opinions about being held. I did all of this while carrying the document in the back of my mind like a load I hadn't yet calculated the full weight of. Diane was unchanged. That was the first thing I noticed in the new light of what I knew. She was completely, convincingly unchanged. The same routines, the same warmth toward Sophie, the same reasonable, companionable evenings, dinner, some television, the domestic shorthand of a couple who have been together long enough to communicate efficiently. She asked about my work. She complained mildly about a case at the firm. She was, by every visible measure, the same woman I had married, which meant either she didn't know I'd found the document, or she did know, and felt entirely secure. I began paying attention differently. Not dramatically, I want to be clear about that. I didn't become a different person overnight, but I started listening beneath the surface of things, watching for the small inconsistencies that emerge when someone is managing a double architecture. The micro-pauses before certain topics. The redirections so practiced they've become invisible. I found them. The first one was the phone. Diane had always been private about her phone in the way of professional people who manage sensitive communications. That had never troubled me. She dealt with client confidentiality at the firm, and I had respected that boundary without examining it. But now I watched more carefully. She texted in the evenings with the screen angled away. When her phone buzzed at the dinner table and she glanced at it, there was a half-second beat before she set it face down, a brief assessment of whether I had seen the screen. I hadn't, those first few times. But I was watching for the beat, not the content. One evening, she left her phone on the counter when she went to check on Sophie, and I saw a name on the notification before the screen darkened. Not a name I recognized. Raymond. I didn't react. I was already learning, in those weeks, the discipline of not reacting. Raymond. I filed it. Continued clearing the dinner dishes. The second sign was subtler and took me longer to identify. Diane had been working late more frequently since my mother's death. 2, sometimes 3 evenings a week. She'd always worked late occasionally. This was more. She attributed it to a complex commercial litigation case that was heading toward trial, and it was plausible enough that I accepted it. But here's what I noticed. She came home from those late evenings with a specific kind of energy. Not tired, charged, slightly above her normal register, in the way of someone who has been in a stimulating conversation rather than a grinding one. She was animated in a way that didn't match the complaint of a long day. Looking back, that energy was the tell I should have read immediately. I registered it, but I dressed it up as dedication. I needed it to be dedication. Frank called me in November, 3 weeks after the funeral. He'd been meeting with Paula, the family attorney who had handled my mother's estate for years, a woman in her 60s with the dry precision of someone who has spent 4 decades watching families navigate their worst moments. Frank called me from the parking lot of Paula's office, which meant he'd heard something he didn't want to discuss where anyone could see his face. Paula asked me something, he said. She asked whether you'd signed anything related to the estate in the period right before or after Mom's death. Something tightened in my chest. What did you tell her? I said I didn't know. Martin, did you? I told him what I'd found. Not all of it. I didn't have all of it yet, but the broad shape. The document in the hospital hallway. The notary stamp. The spousal interest language. The silence on the other end of the line was long enough that I could hear traffic. Paula needs to see it, Frank said. I know. Does Diane know you found it? No. Another pause. How are you holding this together? That was a question I didn't have a clean answer to. I told him I'd been here before. Not with this, but with the particular discipline of finding a structural flaw and having to sit with it quietly while you map the full extent of the damage before you start pulling anything apart. She's your wife? Frank said. I know what she is, I said. I took the document to Paula myself. On a Wednesday afternoon in late November, during a lunch break, I told my office was a dentist appointment. Paula read it twice. Then she set it on her desk and looked at me with the expression of someone who has seen this particular configuration before and is deciding how to calibrate her response. When did you sign this? She asked. I told her. The hallway. The night of the stroke. The pen. And the notarization. Do you know who the notary was? No. She looked at the stamp. I can find out. If this was done improperly, if you weren't in the presence of the notary when you signed, it's potentially void. She paused. But if it was done correctly, Martin, this is a legitimate document. And in Tennessee, elective share law is very specific about spousal rights in inherited property. She's a paralegal, I said. I know. She knew exactly what she was doing. Paula looked at me steadily. What do you want to do? That was the real question. Not the legal question. I could figure out the legal question with time and the right help. The real question was what I wanted to do about the woman who had produced a pre-prepared document in a hospital hallway while my mother was dying, and had handed me a good pen, and had waited with the practiced calm of someone who has planned for this specific moment. I want to understand everything first, I said. Every piece of it, before I do anything. Paula nodded slowly. That's the right instinct. The red herring arrived in the form of Raymond. I'd been building a theory, not deliberately, but in the way that a mind under pressure builds theories, assembling available pieces into the most emotionally available shape. Raymond appeared in my mind as a co-conspirator, an affair, perhaps, or a financial partner. Someone who had helped Diane construct the document, who had a stake in the outcome. I spent 2 weeks fitting Raymond into that architecture. Then, following a lead Paula had identified through the notary stamp, the notarization had been performed by a paralegal at a firm in Nashville, not Diane's firm. I found Raymond. He was a real estate attorney, 63 years old. He had done work for Diane's firm on commercial property transactions for a decade. The notarization had been performed by his office administrator on a document his office had prepared. Raymond wasn't an affair. Raymond was the mechanism. And here is what that told me when I sat with it properly. Diane hadn't constructed this on the night of my mother's stroke. She had constructed it before. The stroke had been the opportunity she had been waiting for, or possibly one of several opportunities she had identified and prepared for. She had gone to Raymond's office, had the document prepared by someone who understood exactly what it meant legally, and then had waited. For how long? That was the question I couldn't answer yet. That was the moment everything reorganized itself in my mind. Not discovering the affair that didn't exist. Not Raymond. The realization that this had been planned before the crisis. That somewhere in the years of our marriage, she had made a calculation about our future and then had begun positioning herself quietly within it. I called my brother again. How long has she known about the property? I asked. Frank was quiet for a moment. What do you mean? The value of the estate. The land. Mom's assets. When did Diane know the specifics? Martin, I told Carol last year when we were doing estate planning. Carol mentioned it to Diane at Thanksgiving. The acreage value, the farmhouse, what it would be worth if we ever sold. He paused. I didn't think. It's not your fault, I said. I'm just mapping it. The Thanksgiving conversation had been 14 months ago. 14 months. Which meant Diane had a 14-month window in which she had known the approximate value of what Frank and I stood to inherit, and during which she had visited Raymond's office and had a document prepared. 14 months of our marriage in which she had been operating on a parallel track. I understood something then that went beyond this specific situation, something about the nature of long deception and what it requires of a person. You can't maintain a hidden architecture for 14 months without having made a fundamental interior decision about the other person. Not a crisis decision, not an impulsive one, a considered one. She had decided, at some point, that I was a resource to be managed rather than a person to be honest with. That understanding didn't make me angry. Not then. It made me very, very calm. January arrived cold and specific, the way January does in Tennessee. Not dramatically cold, but persistently so, with a gray quality to the light that makes everything feel deliberate. I had been building the case for 2 months. Paula was building it with me, quietly, with the methodical patience of someone who has never once confused urgency with haste. We had the document. We had the notarization records from Raymond's office. which established that the document had been prepared 6 weeks before my mother's stroke, a detail that transformed the hospital hallway moment from opportunistic to premeditated. We had the timeline of the Thanksgiving conversation. We had, through a contact Paula trusted at the county assessor's office, a record of an inquiry into the property value of my mother's estate made under a name I didn't immediately recognize. It took me a week to connect that name to Raymond's office administrator. She had done a property value inquiry on my family's land. In August, 2 months before my mother's stroke. The preparation had begun in August. I sat with that number, August, and I counted backward. Sophie had started second grade in August. We had taken a family trip to Gatlinburg that summer. I had photographs on my phone of the three of us on a hiking trail, Diane laughing at something Sophie had said, her face completely open. I had looked at those photographs in October and thought, this is what we are. And in the same month, she had been researching the value of land she intended to claim a legal interest in. I realized I had been confusing the evidence of a life with evidence of a marriage. Those aren't the same thing. A shared photograph proves you were in the same place. It doesn't prove you were building toward the same future. The second layer of the story emerged through Frank's wife, Carol, and this is the part that complicates everything in ways I hadn't anticipated. Carol called me in February, about 3 weeks before I was ready to move. She said she needed to talk to me about something and that she was sorry she hadn't said it sooner. Diane had asked Carol, at Thanksgiving the previous year, about the property. Not casually, specifically. She had asked about the structure of the inheritance, whether there was a will, whether Frank and I had equal shares, and whether any of it was protected against spousal claims. Carol had thought it was practical curiosity, the kind of thing you discuss when you're married to someone with a family estate. She hadn't thought to mention it to Frank. Or to me. I should have said something, Carol said. When I heard you were dealing with the document, I should have put it together. You couldn't have known, I said. She asked me in a way that felt like research, Carol said. I remember that feeling. I explained it away. That detail, Carol's instinct that the conversation felt like research, filed away and dismissed, landed with a particular weight. Because Carol was smart. Carol was not easily misled. And even she had smoothed it over, had given Diane the benefit of an innocent interpretation. That's what skilled long-game deception looks like. It doesn't trigger alarm. It triggers a faint unease that the other person talks themselves out of before it becomes actionable. I found the second document in March. Not in the filing cabinet this time. On Diane's laptop, which she had left open on the kitchen counter while she was in the shower. I didn't plan to look. The screen was visible, and what was visible was a draft of a legal letter, addressed to Paula's firm from Raymond's, referencing the spousal interest claim in the Hargrove property estate and requesting an opportunity to negotiate terms prior to formal filing. She was preparing to file. The letter was dated 2 weeks ahead. She had a target date. I photographed the screen with my phone. Then I went and made coffee and was standing at the counter with my mug when she came back into the kitchen, and I looked at her over the rim of the cup and said, "Morning." "Morning." She went to her laptop without looking at the screen closely. Closed it. "Sophie's almost ready." "I know." I heard her. We moved through the morning with the practice synchronization of parents on a school day schedule. I made Sophie's lunch. Diane helped her find her left shoe. I buckled her into the car and drove her to school with the radio on, listening to her explain the latest developments in Gerald the hamster's social life. I came home. Diane had already left for work. I called Paula. "She's filing in 2 weeks," I said. "I know," Paula said. "I received a preliminary inquiry from Raymond's office yesterday. I was going to call you today." "Are we ready?" A pause. "We're ready." I chose a Saturday. Sophie was at Frank's house. I'd arranged it as a regular uncle-niece day, which Sophie had accepted with the enthusiasm of a child who loves her cousins and needs no further justification. Diane was home. I came into the kitchen at 10 in the morning with 2 folders under my arm and set them on the table between us. She looked at them, then at me. "Sit down," I said. Something passed across her face, a calculation, rapid and precise. Then she sat. I opened the first folder, laid out the original document, the one from the hospital hallway, then the notarization records, then the property inquiry from August, then the timeline I'd reconstructed with Paula's help, showing the preparation of the document in September, 6 weeks before my mother's stroke. I placed each sheet in sequence, without speaking, like laying out exhibits. She watched me do this with the specific stillness of someone who is running internal calculations at high speed while keeping their external surface flat. That stillness, I now understood, was not composure. It was processing time. "You've been busy," she said. "Since October," I said. "Yes. You knew since October, and you didn't say anything." I needed to understand the full picture first. She looked at the documents. Raymond's records, among others. I opened the second folder. Carol's account of the Thanksgiving conversation. The draft letter to Paula's firm, dated March 14th. I set my phone on the table with the photograph of the screen visible. "You were going to file in 2 weeks." A long silence. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the table, at the careful geometry of the evidence laid out in front of her. When she finally looked up, her expression had shifted into something I hadn't seen before. Not guilt exactly, but a kind of assessment, as if she was deciding what version of the truth was still available to her. "The Thanksgiving conversation," she said. "When Carol told me what the property was worth, I started thinking about what would happen if things didn't work out between us. I'm a paralegal, Martin. I know how these estates go. I know how quickly a husband's family can make a wife disappear from an inheritance picture. So, you prepared a document to make sure that couldn't happen. I prepared a document to protect myself. In a hospital hallway, while my mother was dying." The words sat between us. She didn't flinch from them. "I knew it was the right moment legally," she said. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know what that sounds like." Something moved through me. Not the anger I'd expected, but something colder and more final. Because she was right that she wasn't pretending. She was describing, with the clean economy of someone who has stopped managing their image, exactly what she had done and why. There was no performance of remorse in her voice. There was a professional acknowledging a professional calculation. "Were you ever going to use it?" I asked. "If things hadn't, if we'd stayed together, would you have filed?" She looked at me. "I don't know. That's the most honest thing you've said. Martin, I want you to hear something." I kept my voice level. "Paula filed a motion yesterday to have the document invalidated on the grounds of undue influence and procedural fraud. Specifically, the question of whether you were present with the notary when I signed, which you were not, which makes the notarization potentially fraudulent." I paused. "Raymond's office administrator confirmed it in a written statement last week." The stillness broke. Just slightly, a tightening around her eyes. "Raymond won't." "Raymond already did. His administrator signed the statement. He's protecting his license." I closed the second folder. "The document is void, Diane. It has been void since October. I've been waiting to tell you until Paula had everything in place." The silence that followed had a different quality from all the silences before it. This one had weight. The weight of something that has been carefully constructed over 14 months, encountering the architecture that had been quietly built around it. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," I said, "we talk about Sophie. The divorce took 11 months. It was not clean. I want to be honest about that. It was contested, complicated, and expensive, in the way of divorces involving someone who understands legal procedure and is not afraid to use that understanding. Diane fought hard. She challenged Paula's invalidation motion. She introduced counterarguments about the document's intent that required 3 separate hearings to address. In the end, the motion held. The notarization was fraudulent. The administrator confirmed that I had signed in the hospital hallway without a notary present, and that the stamp had been applied after the fact. The document was voided in full. The property passed to Frank and me as our mother had intended. The farmhouse, the land, the 12 acres that my grandfather had broken ground on and my father had maintained and my mother had loved with the specific, uncomplicated devotion of a woman who understood exactly what she'd built. Diane left Hargrove. She took a position at a firm in Nashville, which was where she'd always been suited. Sophie goes to her every other weekend and for a month in the summer, and their relationship is finding its own shape slowly, in the way of things that have been damaged and are being rebuilt by people who both love the same child. Sophie asked me once, on the drive home from one of those weekends, whether Diane and I would ever be friends again. I thought about it honestly. "I think we'll always care about how you're doing," I said. "That's a kind of friendship." She considered this with the gravity of a 9-year-old processing an adult distinction. "But not the kind where you call each other." "Probably not that kind, no." She nodded, looked out the window at the Tennessee dark rolling past. "That's okay," she said. You have Uncle Frank for that. The farmhouse is mine now. Frank and I divided the property. He kept the south acreage. I kept the house and the 3 acres surrounding it. I've been doing work on it slowly, on weekends, in the particular way of a man who needs to do something with his hands while his mind is still sorting through a large amount of material. My mother planted roses along the east fence line 20 years ago. They'd gone half wild while she was ill. I've been cutting them back, properly, the way she showed me once when I was a teenager and had more impatience than sense. It's slow work. The right kind of slow. Paula told me, the last time we spoke about the case, that she'd seen variations of this before, not frequently, but enough. A spouse who works in law or finance, who understands the architecture of inheritance better than their partner does, who begins planning for contingencies years before those contingencies arrive. She said the most common version doesn't involve overt malice. It involves a person who has decided, quietly and rationally, that security matters more than honesty, and who has enough professional knowledge to act on that decision without appearing to. The hard part, Paula said, is that the planning coexists with a real life. The document in the hospital hallway doesn't mean she never loved you. It means she loved you and was also doing this. Both things were true at the same time. I've thought about that a lot. Both things were true at the same time. That's not a comfort exactly, but it's more accurate than the simpler story, the one where she was calculating from the beginning, where the love was performance, where I was only ever a mechanism. That story is cleaner. It's also wrong. The truth is harder to hold. A real marriage, a real family, real years, and alongside all of it, a quiet parallel architecture that she maintained without my knowledge, against the day she decided she might need it. I don't know exactly when she made that decision. I'm not sure she could tell me if I asked. There's a version of this story where I ask that question and it matters. But I've come to understand that the specific moment of a decision like that is less important than the fact of it. She decided. She built. She waited. The wind doesn't change the shape of the thing. Sophie called the farmhouse the big old house when she first visited after I'd started working on it. She ran the fence line twice and identified 3 places where she said rabbits had been digging. She is 9 years old and has her mother's precise observational intelligence and my tendency to stand still in a space and figure out how it fits together before moving through it. She's going to be formidable. I know this already. On her last visit, she sat on the porch steps in the late afternoon light and asked me who had planted the roses. Your grandmother, I said. She looked at them for a long moment, half wild still, but greener now, with new growth starting at the base where I'd cut back the dead wood. They look like they're trying, she said. I sat down beside her. Yeah, I said. That's about right. What this story exposes, at its core, is the specific vulnerability of trust that has never been tested. Martin and Diane had 9 years of functional, even genuinely affectionate marriage, a shared child, a shared home, the accumulated evidence of a life built together. And precisely because that foundation felt solid, Martin never interrogated it. He extended credit indefinitely, without audit, the way you do with structures you assume have been built correctly. Diane's betrayal wasn't impulsive. It was architectural. She identified a potential future risk, the inheritance, and began quietly engineering a solution well before the crisis arrived. The Thanksgiving conversation in which Carol disclosed the property value wasn't the cause of her planning. It was the trigger that activated a contingency she had perhaps been conceptually ready to build for longer. That distinction matters, because it means the marriage itself was never entirely what Martin experienced it as. Part of Diane was always running a parallel calculation, a professional reflex, maybe, but one that had crossed a line from prudence into premeditation. What neither of them ever had, apparently, was a frank conversation about financial security in the marriage. Diane's fear of being erased from an inheritance picture was real. She named it directly in the confrontation. But she never once raised it with Martin. She went straight from the fear to the document, skipping the conversation entirely. That skip is where the marriage actually broke. Not in the hospital hallway. In the decision not to say, I'm worried about where I stand if this doesn't work out. A real conversation that never happened became a document that nearly destroyed everything. What I keep returning to, thinking about this story, is the pen. The heavy, good pen that came out of a coat pocket in a hospital hallway at 11 at night. You don't carry a pen like that by accident. You carry it when you're ready to use it. And here's what that image says to me. Most betrayals don't arrive with warnings. They arrive looking like preparedness, like competence, like someone who always knows what needs to be done. We fall in love with capability, and we don't always ask what it's being applied to. If there's one thing worth taking from this story, it's that financial transparency in a marriage isn't a sign of distrust. It's a sign of respect. The conversation Diane never had with Martin was the one that might have made everything else unnecessary. Some documents should never have to be signed, but some conversations should never be avoided.